It is Friday, March 29th, and my name is Noel Pfeffer. I serve as Executive Director of the city's Community Development Administration. I'm joined today by Rashonda Alexander, our Director of Compliance, by Lisa Jones, our CDBG Disaster Recovery Program Manager, by Tom Nagel, our Public Information Officer, and by Sarah Russell, the city's Emergency Management Commissioner. Thank you all for joining us today. And we'll be going over a presentation providing an overview of CDBG-DR funds, their eligible uses, and the process by which we will be allocating them. Sarah will be providing an overview of the 2022 floods impact and the city's response. And then finally, Rashonda Alexander on our team will be providing an overview of some of the programs that we're exploring. And the purpose here is really to invite you all to provide input, ask questions, provide feedback, so that we make sure that we're on the right track as we move forward in releasing our draft action plan. Tommy, if you can share the slides. And I'll keep talking in the meantime. The way that the process works, the way that HUD's processes work with CDBG-DR is that we start by consulting stakeholders, by conducting an unmet needs analysis and taking this data, taking this input to produce a draft action plan. And at CDA, we're always committed to going through a community-driven and data-informed process as we propose how to allocate funds. That draft plan will be released in early May before we then collect another round of public input and public comment, at which point then we'll incorporate that public comment and submit the action plan to HUD. So this is a very first step in this process and the very preliminary input and feedback that we are seeking as we prepare our draft action plan. Tommy, next slide. And I think I'm going to skip through these first couple of slides pretty quickly because I've already talked about our agenda. That will be providing an overview of CDBG-DR, an overview of the flood impact and unmet needs analysis, and an overview of these potential programs and activities. However, first, I did miss this as I was just talking. I'll share a little bit about CDA. Next slide, please, Tom. So CDA is the city's Community Development Administration. We are a city department charged with administering HUD and other federal, state, and local funds on behalf of the city of St. Louis. And our mission is really to implement the mayor's economic justice agenda by leveraging federal funds in partnership with dozens of public and private partners to build affordable housing, provide public services like food assistance, senior services, workforce development assistance, and much more, youth services, others, and to empower neighborhoods and residents to revitalize communities across the city. And the city's Economic Justice Action Plan really stands for two core principles that are some of our guiding stars or guiding principles. These are, first of all, that equity is a precondition to growth, that the city cannot grow until we heal the scars of segregation, until that the city cannot grow while half of it is being left behind. And then that in the same way that the state of North St. Louis today and the disinvestment was intentional, a product of redlining, of appraisal gaps, of restrictive covenants, of, in short, segregation. That we must be equally intentional in reversing it. So that's one guiding principle. The second one is that it's not enough to invest in the built environment. It's not enough to develop St. Louis. We must empower residents and empower communities in order to transform our city. That it's not enough to invest in the built environment. We need to invest in people. And that's why something you'll hear over and over again as we talk about these CDBG disaster recovery funds is our number one priority is household relief, providing relief to individuals affected by the flooding. So if you're listening and you've been affected by the flood, please get in touch with us so we can get you on a list to be among the first beneficiaries of these funds once programs are up and running in early 2025. Next slide. So again, I covered this largely, but the purpose of today's workshop is to invite residents to ask questions, to learn about our process for identifying unmet needs, to provide public comments and provide feedback as to whether we're on the right track with respect to our proposed activities. And with respect to unmet needs, I'll explain at a high level that the way that CDBG-DR funding works, and you can move to the next slide, is that they are funds of last resort. CDBG-DR funds are used to address needs, impacts of the disaster, damage that the disaster caused that has not been met with either FEMA funds or other federal funds or insurance. So they're kind of final gap financing. And we know, by the way, that there's so many people who were impacted by the flood, who had their homes flooded or their cars inundated, that have not been able to recover from FEMA, have not been able to recover from insurance. And this is exactly, these funds represent the opportunity to have these needs met. So some more background on CDBG-DR funds. These are direct congressional appropriations. There is a line item in a federal statute that says St. Louis is being awarded $25.8 million in federal funds in response to the July 22 flooding. And so, first of all, we want to really thank our Congresswoman, Congresswoman Cori Bush, for her advocacy and fighting for these grants, which included direct outreach to then HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge, and the Biden administration for making these funds available to us. So how can these disaster recovery funds be used? And it's worth noting, by the way, that because the flooding did not just impact St. Louis, the city of St. Louis, but also impacted St. Louis County, and in many ways impacted St. Louis County more profoundly than the city, that the county has also been awarded $56 million in CDBG DR funds. And so we are working hand in hand and in partnership with the county to leverage these funds for maximum impact, so that we can grow more resilient to flooding, not just as a city or as a county, but as a region. So how can CDBG-DR funds be used? They may be used for household relief, housing, economic revitalization, infrastructure, planning and mitigation. We'll provide more details on each of those in the next slide. I explained the funding of last resort element, but another important element is that there needs to be tie back to the disaster. So who is eligible to receive the funding? Members of the public impacted by the disaster. Now it says there that they cannot receive CDBG-DR funds directly from HUD. That's true. HUD awards the funds to the city. But what the city is going to do is we're going to stand up programs and provide application forms to residents to apply to become beneficiaries of these funds and receive either home repair or other sorts of direct household support. Next slide. So all CDBG-DR funds must meet a national objective. All HUD funds must meet a national objective. And those national objectives include: one, activities that serve low to moderate income individuals. Who is a low to moderate income individual? If you're an individual that's under 50,000, that's someone who earns under $50,000. If we're talking about a family of four, that's a family of four that earns under $86,000. So we're talking about solidly middle income families. The second national objective is activities which prevent or eliminate slum or blight. That is to say, which transform our vacant property from a liability into an asset. And finally, activities which respond to urgent needs, which includes disaster recovery, and in particular, which responds to urgent needs created by natural catastrophes. In addition, these activities must address a direct or indirect impact of the July 22 disaster. So that's what's known as the tie-back requirement. Whatever activities we fund, we need to be able to tie it back to the original 2022 flood. And they must be located in a most impacted and distressed county, which includes the city of St. Louis. Next slide. And more specifically, eligible activities include household relief, including home repair, which has not been covered by FEMA insurance. It includes housing construction and repair, because we know that a lot of housing was destroyed by the flooding. And so building back that supply is a key disaster recovery response. Economic activities such as economic assistance to small businesses or investments to help create jobs or support job training to support individuals who may have lost their jobs due to the flooding, if they either became unhoused or lost their cars, or to create jobs that were lost when businesses had to close due to the flooding. Infrastructure, including the repair and replacement of disaster impacted infrastructure or facilities such as streets, water and sewer facilities, playground, as well as green infrastructure to recover from the flooding. So we know that that includes, for example, the River de Pere was deeply impacted by the flooding and experienced some damage, as well as green infrastructure such as permeable alleys, bump outs, rain gardens, and detention basins, and others. And finally, and critically, an eligible activity is planning. And planning is so essential because especially as we explore investments into infrastructure that may be much larger than this $25.8 million can fund, may run tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars. We need to make a holistic plan for the city, but really for the region and for our watershed for stormwater management. Because we know that as a city and as a region, we seem to be experiencing 100-year floods every few years. And that means that we need to have a comprehensive stormwater management plan. And that's typically done by watershed. And so we have in the region and in the city of St. Louis, the River de Pere watershed, the Mississippi watershed, and Missouri River watershed, all of which need to be planned for accordingly. And we also need to do disaster preparedness planning to ensure that SEMA, or Emergency Management Agency, is prepared to respond when there is a flood, and not just SEMA, but every city department knows exactly what its responsibilities and duties are if and when a flood happens. Next slide. So what does the process look like? First, before we can spend a dime, we need to submit our action plan to HUD for approval. So before we can do anything, we need to tell HUD, here's what we plan to do. And HUD has certain requirements for what they want to see included in the action plan. The first requirement is that unmet needs analysis that I've alluded to a few times. We essentially say, here was the impact of the 22 flood. Here is the resources that have already been deployed in response, both from FEMA, the federal government, and by insurance. And here's the remaining gap. We also need to conduct citizen engagement and stakeholder consultation. I'll talk more about those in the next slide. And then finally, of course, we need to say to HUD, here's the programs that we propose to fund. Here's their budget, here's the program design, here's our compliance plan, etc. And Rashonda will be talking more about those shortly. Next slide. So our stakeholder engagement, that as I mentioned is a necessary component of the action plan, includes coordinating with the state, with other city public entities, including the Metropolitan Sewer District, working with our federal partners at FEMA, the Small Business Administration, HUD, and many the EPA and other departments, working with nonprofits and community organizations, with private businesses and representative groups, and with advocacy organizations and neighborhood stakeholders. Next slide. And then as discussed, we also have certain citizen participation requirements. These include, if we can move to the next slide, a public hearing. And we are required to hold at least one public hearing before submitting our action plan, maintaining a public website to allow individuals seeking assistance to both see how grant funds are being deployed, but also to sign up for a waiting list and to apply, and to go through a 30-day public comment period. Next slide. And finally, and most importantly, before I toss it over to Sarah, I'll provide a brief action plan timeline. And I've alluded to this over the course of this presentation, but our plan is to post a draft action plan for public comment in early May 2024, to hold a public hearing to get feedback on that draft action plan in June 2024, and then to submit the updated action plan, which incorporates this feedback to HUD in August 2024. We'll then proceed to appropriate the funds in September and October 2024, and we hope to receive HUD approval for our proposed programs in October 2024, and then begin launching our programs for application in early 2025. So with that, I'll toss it over now to our Commissioner of Emergency Management, Sarah Russell. Next slide, and over to you, Sarah.
All right, thank you. So I do want to thank everyone at CDA for, involving us and bringing emergency management to the table. This has really been a great opportunity for us to collaborate on some of the development of these programs and to be able to participate in opportunities like today with our community stakeholders. So I'm going to talk about a little bit about the unmet needs analysis and results. So as many are aware, survey has now been open for a little while. We've done some in-person opportunities this week to help people fill out that survey and get some response, as well as people that have taken it from the website as well. So thank you, and please continue to encourage people to participate in that. It's really giving us the good information, the updated information on what the unmet needs are at this point from that July of 2022 flooding. When we're talking about the community's unmet needs, the city is going to keep the following key concepts in mind. So the broad impact of the disaster to the city's infrastructure, as well as the housing stock, and not just specific damages. Also identifying needs that were not recognized by other programs and funding sources, such as the Federal Emergency Management Agency and Small Business Administration, insurance, and other charity sources or nonprofit support. And as well as addressing the needs at a community-wide and individual level. So we've already started to hear from individuals about some of those individual level needs. And I will tell you from the onset of the disaster, in speaking with survivors myself, we talked about those immediate opportunities and then the continued monitoring for other opportunities that came up for programs and meeting those unmet needs. And this is just another one of those programs, which fortunately we're able to bring to the community and try to meet some of those ongoing needs. Next slide, please. So looking at disaster impacts, this chart will show you a little bit of a difference. So we look at a couple of different populations. So we have owner-occupied homes, and you can see the way that the categorization has been made, and these are according to FEMA standards. So when FEMA comes in and does an assessment, they will categorize using those damage categories on the left-hand column. So severe, major to high, major to low, minor to high, and minor to low. Of course, we know that anyone that's been impacted by disaster, it's severe to you personally, but this is just a way to help categorize the needs across a number of different disasters. So in some disasters, maybe a catastrophic tornado where the landscape is almost wiped clean from the high winds and houses are completely removed, versus a house that can be partially rebuilt or just have some damage repaired. So that's what we're seeing in the category on the left-hand side. So you can see that there were 7 owners that were reported to have severe damage of $38,000 or more from our flooding incident. So that gives you kind of an idea. And if we shift to the left-hand side, I'm going to try and shrink that just for a minute to be able to see that right-hand side collects renter-occupied homes. So we know a number of people rent. And again, this is showing the damage category among renters. So you can see there is a disparity there, just as we start to look at the type and severity of damage that we had from this flood. Next slide, please. So this map shows some call data that we received from the United Way 211 during the July 2022 flood. So you can see that there weren't many limits on where flooding impacted the city. However, you can see that there was several concentrated areas, primarily in North St. Louis communities. Next slide, please. So the survey on disaster needs is ongoing, but as of March, we have had 117 residents who have responded. So again, this data is really going to be helpful to us when we understand the numbers of people and their specifics on unmet needs. So it is really a valuable tool for us to be able to collect that data of what is still going on in the current flood impact in the city. Next slide, please. So looking at some more data, so the CDA Community Resident Survey on disaster needs, here is a question: how were you affected by the 2022 floods? So of the respondents up until this presentation was made, you can see some had direct impact. And then there was still a subsection of people that were indirectly impacted. So if you experience direct impact, that may be that your home was damaged. You maybe lost a vehicle. Indirect impact may have been your place of work was damaged. If it had to close or, close temporarily, close permanently, those would be indirect impacts. And then we have respondents that had no impact at all, but still are providing feedback for the survey. So you can see by and large, there was a large number of respondents that did have direct impact to their home, and possibly vehicle for the flooding. Next slide, please. So another question that we're discussing is, if you have remaining unmet needs, what is the estimate of the amount needed to recover from the disaster? So bringing you back to where you were at the time that the flood occurred. So showing the breakdowns, I'll start at the bottom in red. Over $25,000 needed to help you recover from this flood. That was a fairly large segment. Cost between 10,000 to 25,000, a smaller section, and then the largest section somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000, and those are a lot of needs that still remain unmet, based upon, again, if you've gone through your insurance, if you've gotten something dispersed from FEMA in the immediate aftermath, perhaps you got an SBA loan as well. So these are what is still outstanding to get people back to whole. And then again, there is a fairly substantial number of people that could complete their recovery for under $5,000. So all of these responses are being considered when we look into the programs that we're going to get in later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So another question, while the city's top priority is to deploy funds to provide relief to eligible households, CDBG-DR funds can also be used for green infrastructure, floodplain management. Which of the following investments do you support? So that's starting to get into the question of where would we like to concentrate this money? Where would it be most effective in the eyes of the survey respondents? Looking at the chart on the right, you can see that they're pretty close as far as numbers right now where people are putting their priorities. So we see river restoration, detention basins, permeable alleys, rain gardens, and curb bump outs. So those are some of the means that we can use to help manage where the stormwater goes. There will be more details on these when we get into the program section. Next slide, please. So looking at the City of St. Louis hazard summary, this is a snapshot of a tool that we use from emergency management to establish what hazards exist in our community and what the severity and overall risk is. So if the hazard is observed, what is the severity of the damage that it can do? And then we have an overall risk. So you can see the highest overall risks exist with heat, severe winter weather, as well as flood. So we do see these pretty much every year in the city of St. Louis. Some are, a little more extreme from year to year than others. We obviously didn't see a great deal of severe winter weather this year. But we have seen some increased heat with additional heat waves and longer duration heat waves. And of course, we do see pretty regular cycle of river flooding. And of course, the incident that we're focusing on here being flash flooding. This was one of the more severe incidents of flash floodings that we've seen in, over the past 100 years. I think the last notable it was very similar to the 2022 flooding. It occurred in 1915. So very high impact to most parts of the city and doing a large number of damage. Next slide, please. So hazard risk assessment, this is something that we do in emergency management on an ongoing basis. We also look at this from a regional perspective. We work with our partners each year, and the map that you see as an example is put together by the East-West Gateway Council of Governments. So they're very instrumental in those assessments that we do. When we look at the risks and how much of our population is centered in those risk areas. So high hazard floodplains are located throughout the city, and they do run through some of the most densely populated and vulnerable communities within the city. Next slide. So one of the other tools that we have to use is the Social Vulnerability Index. And this is a tool that's compiled by the CDC, and it shows community-based information based on the U.S. Census data, and it determines the relative social vulnerability for every census tract within the U.S. So it can show us different things, moderate to high social vulnerability to shocks and stresses such as flood hazards exist in neighborhoods throughout the city. Using that data, we know that disasters are not equitable. So if we have a segment of our community, a census tract that already is showing high levels of vulnerability that then becomes impacted by a disaster, we know that we're going to have to find more funding sources and try to put together more programs to meet the needs and get those communities back to at least where they were before the flooding or the other hazard has impacted the neighborhood. Next slide, please.
My
Are
computer,
we hanging up?
a little, there we go. It's
Oh,
a little frozen.
like we jumped ahead a little. We jumped ahead a few slides there. I think that one was it. So looking at these two maps really tell, they're very telling as far as what they show. So the map on the left shows the tree canopy for the St. Louis area. So you can see where the darker green is, that's where the more dense tree canopy is, much more green spaces, which are able to kind of offset some of the heat that we experience. And then the map on the right shows the heat vulnerability. Those are the areas that you can see don't have as much green space. They're not quite as able to keep the heat from being absorbed, retaining the heat. You may hear in the news sometimes mention of the heat island effect. That's why you see all of that red, the heat island. That's what we're talking about. It takes it longer to cool off. So the overnight temperatures don't have an opportunity to dip quite as low as they do in some of the outer lying areas on the map to the left that are darker green. So this really tells a story from an emergency management perspective when we're looking at, the risks that we have as far as our population that we're serving, and some of the places we need to try and prioritize on services to meet those needs. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over now to Rashonda, who's going to talk about potential activities.
Thank you, Sarah. So the city's proposing the activities below to benefit our low to moderate income residents and neighborhoods. Home repair, home buyout and relocation, housing relief, small business relief, floodplain mitigation planning, green infrastructure, flood response capacity, and reserve are all potential activities for the CDBG-DR funds. Next slide. Drilling down into them, we see home repair funds will be available to rehab homes that were impacted by the floods, and the city will oversee and manage a pool of contractors that will carry out that repair work that was not necessarily completed at the time of the flood, that still remains, because we want to remember that these were unmet needs. So we met a lot of people that still had a lot of home repairs. And this program would be for your mechanical system repairs, your structural repairs, the mold remediation that still is existing in your home, and any other flood damage. Next slide. This seemed to be one that was really very popular at our open house at Wohl Center this week. Home buyouts and relocation program is another proposed activity where funds could be used to purchase the at-risk property from the owners and then provide relocation assistance to safe housing. And then the acquired property will be owned by the city or by the designated organization to conserve the land. Once acquired, the land cannot be redeveloped, and it can be transferred or transformed into like a park or some other community amenity. Next slide. Household relief. So people who were struggling for essential household items, like their cars that were destroyed, this is an option to help provide assistance for the household in that way. Now, we want you to note that it's not an approved program yet through HUD, and they will require some additional approval and a waiver for this program, but we are trying to confirm if there's a need, and if so, we will do all that we can to request that approval from HUD and the corresponding waiver that will be required for this level of household relief. Next slide, please. Small businesses were affected during the floods, and this program would help those businesses who are still experiencing hardships due to the flood and apply for grants to help, loans to recover for your business from any business activity loss, damaged property, or overall impacts to your employees. Next slide, please. Mitigation planning is not the most fun, right? But it's very necessary to help improve the stormwater management during times like the floods. We can do things like rain gardens, catchment basins, more tree planting, as we saw in the slides that Sarah presented, to help with overheating, street grid improvements, and then the restoration plan for the River de Pere, because the River de Pere study would focus on the levee restoration and devices that will monitor the river levels and explore creation of accessible green space that would also produce and prevent future flood hazard risks. Next slide, please. Green infrastructure, tree planting, and rain gardens informed by the flood management plan. The city will plant trees in areas to help mitigate the flooding, help with heat waves, and improve air quality. And rain gardens, catchment basins, and green infrastructure, we would propose a design and construction of some green infrastructure at very strategic points in the community that are accessible and that would help also manage risk and redirect floodwaters. This is our last option, I believe. Next slide. No, this is a good option. We need help. We need more people to help with flood response. And this is a program that will build capacity for the city to provide emergency management staff. And then also it will create a resource distribution plan and an operation deployment plan for extreme weather events. Funding will go toward inner city fund and hiring 2 additional staff members to manage the program. And funding will go toward administrative and program delivery for fiscal planning and strategy staff members at the city. Next slide, please. During the flood, people need additional resources, and the flood response reserve would pair with the resource distribution plans and be used to purchase emergency respond goods that could be deployed in the initial hours and days that follow a disaster event. And that will be combined with the deployment plan. It would ensure the city has the supplies ready and on deck to assist disaster victims with a minimum delay. This is also a note that's not a current approved HUD program, and it will also require a waiver. But if your response is that it's something you want, this is what we will pursue with HUD for additional approval. Next slide. So that is now the end of our potential and proposed activities. I am going to give it back to one of our team members so we can tell you how to provide additional feedback surrounding CDBG DR and through survey. You know what, I can do it too. So this is how you provide feedback. Send us a survey, respond to the survey, not send it. Respond to the survey. You will find a CDBG-DR website link on the city's page. There's a survey there. We've been in the community with paper surveys. Email us if you need. We also, you can send us something through the mail. You can join more of our in-person presentations virtually or not. And then we'll have a public hearing that will be scheduled in May, still to be determined. Also in the chat, the link to the survey has just been placed. So if you want, go to the chat now, copy it, and take the survey now so we can see what you need. Next slide, please.
I believe this is
That's
our
it.
last slide.
Yeah, all right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rashonda, for that overview of our proposed programs and detailing how to provide feedback. We're happy to answer any questions from any participants on the call now. And also welcome any comments as well.
So if you have a question or a comment, you can put that into the chat and we'll answer it there. You can also go ahead and just raise your hand and we'll bring you into the conversation. Ask away. If you've been affected by the flood and you want to share your experience with us, we want to learn about you and your case and keep you on our radar. So if you have a story, if you experience something, we want to hear from you. So whether you have a suggestion for this program or want to share your experiences, we want to hear from you. Go ahead and raise your hand or put that into the chat.
I
We
also
also
want to take this opportunity to thank ICF, the Inner City Fund, our consultants who have been supporting us throughout this process. We wouldn't be here today without their guidance and support. So thank you to Lexi, who's joining us today, but the broader team as well, Ann and Jim, who were here in person in St. Louis a few days ago, and Chris and many others. We really appreciate your support, especially on the pretty data intensive unmet needs analysis. That's a key piece of this action plan.
Absolutely. And I think that the unmet needs analysis only gives us a really good idea of what historically has been recorded. We need to see that validated in the survey response. So just echoing what Sarah and Rashonda and Noel said, it's really important that we hear your voices so that we know which programs will be the most impactful to meet the unmet needs that still remain in the community. That's how we'll build the most effective programs for St. Louis.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. I'm also seeing a question in the chat that I want to answer from Tobias, who asks, funds will not be available until early 2025. And the answer is exactly right. For individual applicants, for individuals who are seeking the benefit of these funds, those funds won't be available until early 2025. Because these are HUD funds, HUD moves slow. And even though the flood happened in 2022, these funds weren't even appropriated by Congress until 2023. And we're just getting guidance from HUD about the process by which we'll be kind of allocating these funds. So we're moving as quickly as we can, but unfortunately, these are funds of last resort that aren't meant to serve as kind of immediately emergency relief, but as the name kind of implies, as disaster recovery funds to come in after insurance, after the Federal Emergency Management Administration to meet kind of anything that these other programs missed.
And something that's really unique about receiving a community development block grant from HUD is that there isn't really a set program that you can just like pull off the shelf and press play on. It really is designed, this is flexible money. We can customize where we use the funding to really meet the needs that exist in the community, which is why the city's put together such a comprehensive proposal of potential ways to create programs that will effectively meet the needs of the community. So again, that's a little bit why this is a bit of a longer process, but it's one that ultimately allows for more customization for the actual community impacts.
That's a great point. It also reminds me of another important point, which is that while our vision here is comprehensive and our hopes are to stand up as many of these programs as possible, we also face funding and resource and capacity constraints. And the reality is that doing every single one of these programs that was mentioned today would likely take in the order of about 15 to 20 employees. And that would eat up a huge chunk of the funds and frankly go beyond our admin cap. So what we're really trying to do here through this process, through this engagement process and dialogue with the public, is hear from you what are the top priorities so that we can pick the 3 to 5 most important programs and do a really good job of standing those up in a timely manner instead of trying to do everything and winding up doing everything not particularly well.
Yeah, and to just add to that point, this is something that isn't required by HUD at this point in the process. So your city teams are really doing everything to go above and beyond and hear your voice as a community member that was impacted so that they can develop the most customized program to meet the unmet needs that are prioritized by the community. So this is really your opportunity to let your voice be heard so that you can see your voice in the programs that are ultimately stood up by your city teams.
All right, with that, we're at time more or less. If there are no further questions from the public, I'll invite anyone who wants to share any final comments to do so now, and then we'll wrap up. Any final comments from the team? All righty. Thank you all for joining us, both members of our team and the public. And enjoy a beautiful weekend. Happy Friday.